Good morning. The reading this morning is taken from the book of James, the first chapter, reading verses 2 through 5. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you.
Oh. I just managed to set this off on the right lesson. Okay. You'll understand how appropriate that was to the lesson in just a second here, but there we go. I want to start off by just acknowledging that we are thrilled that Joey Cabillas is here. We have been waiting for your arrival, Joey. Where are you? Want to stand up? And their story will fit in very well with what we're talking about this morning. We've had a great weekend last weekend with Everett Huffer in, and our annual Grow weekend. Just a thrilling time. And this is going to do this to me, and I am not very happy, but okay, guys at the back, you're going to have to try to follow me. Okay, so we were talking, our theme for this year for our sermons, Jay and Miles put together a really great program, and it's dealing with spiritual growth and maturity. And for the month of May, our theme is growing through trials. See, I told you this would be really good with what's starting out here. I'm starting out with trials. So, okay. And our lesson today, and I called it Thorns and Thistles. You'll kind of understand that in a minute. But basically, it's the idea of the purpose of our trials. And I just want to kind of think about the fact that we all have bad days, don't we? We joke about it because we talk about a concept that we call Murphy's Law. You know Murphy's Law? How many don't know Murphy's Law? How many don't know that expression? Okay, Murphy's Law basically says that anything that can go wrong will. So you just kind of, when you're planning things, you just kind of allow for a factor for things to become different. So we kind of want to think about the idea of why do we have trials and suffering? Because we really need, I would call this, we need to have a theology, use the big term, of suffering and trials and hardships, because they're going to happen. And, if you talk with a lot of people out in the world who do not believe, that is one of the reasons that they will give you why they don't believe, is because of the difficulties and the problems that come with life. And I think it's because of that type of expectation that somehow the existence of God should prevent it from happening. And I hope maybe I could say some things that, Everett last week talked about the idea of, through the weekend that, is doing a series of lessons like he did, that it's kind of like a dinner, and there's the meat, and there's the veggies, and there's, all the salad. And well, I'm going to say that probably today it's going to be meat with a gristle. It's not going to be the nice juicy meat that he served, because I need to challenge you. I want you to think, there may be some things that we talk about that you may not have really thought about. You may never have been taught. You may never have understood. And part of this is things that have kind of come together in my life. I've been a Christian for over 60 years. And through that time, I've learned a lot through, I guess, what I would call the school of hard knocks. And one of the questions that often comes up is, does God cause our suffering? And we'll kind of touch on that as we go through. Now, I want to start with Ecclesiastes, a passage from Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes often gets lumped in as what is called part of the poetry books of the Old Testament. It's not poetry. It is, like Proverbs, what we would call wisdom literature. And Ecclesiastes looks like it was written by Solomon. He refers to himself in ways that, as the wisdom that God gave him, as one of the greatest of the kings, and he records some of his observations. And his observations are really very interesting. And Ecclesiastes 9:11, it's one of those really important observations. He says, I've seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned. Now, the way I kind of summarized this for Richard was the idea, we take it to a sports motif, and those of us who like sports know the principle that it isn't necessarily the fastest or the best, or in life, it's not the richest, it's not the strongest, but what does the writer here observe? Time and chance happen to them all. And those of us who follow sports know that you may come to the big game and you think, oh, our team, the Bombers, the Jets, whoever, are going to just blow the other team out, and they don't. Why? Well, and the coaches will say something like, the puck or the ball wasn't bouncing in our favor. And you think about it, you don't really want to come down to, and for those who follow what the world calls football and we call soccer, the whole game can come down to what we call the luck of the bounce. And something may, and so the idea that time and chance happen to all. And in this case, it's understanding that trials and hardships happen to everybody. We get the idea sometimes that things are just picking on me. It's not all about me. It's not all about you. That is just the nature of life. The things happen so that as we look at what's happening, I put in the little teaser for the bulletin, the quote from the old poem, but it's the idea, into every life a little rain must fall. Jesus talked about the sun shining on the just and the unjust, the rain falling on the just and the unjust. We don't get up in the morning and the weather looks and says, oh, you're a Christian, you're going to have a great day. You're not a Christian, you're going to have a really rotten day. Because what if you're a Christian and you're planning to go to the beach, you want a sunny day. If you're a farmer and you're planning to raise your crop, you want a rainy day. You can't control. And the fact is, we know that sometimes there's droughts and sometimes there's floods. Sometimes there's so much sun, and some of us can remember times that we've been out in the sun and just horribly burned ourselves because of enjoying too much of a good thing. So, Paul, who was an apostle of Jesus Christ, was not immune, and even describes himself as being tormented by a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. Jesus, the writer of Hebrews, says that although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. You think of Jesus learning obedience? Well, Jesus had to submit himself to God's will. He had to learn. There is nobody who has ever lived on this earth who has been immune. And as a kid, I used to like to play Monopoly. Some of my friends used to call it monotony. Because it went on. I had a good friend when I was a kid, elementary school age, about grade 4, grade 5. He lived right behind me. We had Monopoly games that went on for days. And we would slide the board under our beds. We'd do one game at his house, and when we finished that, then we'd do it at my house. And we'd carefully slide it under the bed so we could pull it back out and continue the next day. And we'd go for days. But with that game, there were cards. There were the chance and community chest cards, and in those piles of cards, there would be a card that said "Get out of jail free," because part of the game is things would happen and you'd end up in jail. Thankfully, not in real life, but nobody gets to get out of suffering, get out of hardship, get out of trials card for free. Does not happen. All of us will have that. So we need to understand a principle here, and I'll explain where it comes from. Sufferings and trials come because the creation is subject to frustration and decay. Now, that may challenge you because you think back Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the story of the creation, and goes through the creation, and with each day, it kind of reiterates what happened in that day, and then says there was evening and morning, and God saw that it was good. That everything was good. But what happens is that Adam and Eve come along, and they listen to Satan, and they disobey God. And there are consequences that result to it. So they lost their place in the perfect paradise of Eden. And so because we no longer live in Eden, we live under what is referred to in Genesis 3 and Revelation 22 as the curse. Did you know that? See, what happens is that when God does the creation, and then in chapter 2, it says that he creates man and woman, and Adam and Eve, and puts them in the garden, and commissions them, tells them to work. Yeah, work existed before the fall. So don't blame Adam for work. Now, blame him for the kind of work, but don't blame him for the work, because they were put in the garden to work and look after. But God puts this tree of the knowledge of good and evil into the garden and tells them to not eat. For the day that you eat from it, you will certainly die. Now, Satan comes along and says, no, God doesn't really mean that. He knows if you eat that, you'll be just as smart as he is. And so Eve eats, and she gives it to Adam to eat. And then God comes, and there are consequences that come for that. For the serpent, for Satan, for Eve, and for Adam. We want to focus on the ones for Adam here, because what God says to Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. See, Adam's work has been, we would call agricultural or agrarian, in the garden, looking after the trees and basically gathering the fruit of the garden for them to eat. And now, look at what happens. Through painful toil, through thorns and thistles, that's where I got the title for the sermon, and the sweat of your brow, you'll do that. Life and work are going to become very, very hard. And we understand that that's why we call it work, right? You know, you don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to the office and play. No, we are, whatever my job is, I got to go to work. And we know that that's going to be hard, and that's going to be difficult, and may not even be pleasant, may not be very fulfilling. But that's the nature of what happens because of that. And then you will return to the ground or the earth or the dust. Kind of depends on the translation that you're reading. But it's, you know, for dust you are, and dust you will become. That's not a very optimistic view. That's something we really want to think about. But then God banishes Adam and Eve from the garden. And humanity has to live for the rest of time on earth in this cursed world. Now, that's why John, in 1 John, actually can say the whole world is under the power of the evil one. Yes, God created the world and the universe. God is power. God is over. But Adam and Eve gave Satan a place in their world and in their hearts. And because of that, there are consequences that all humanity is going to have to bear. There are going to be issues and there are going to be problems. And so there's a parenthesis I like to think about sometimes in the Bible. You may never have noticed this, but in Genesis 3, where God tells them of the curse, in Revelation 22, that's the first book of the Bible. Revelation 22, the last book of the Bible, the last chapter, chapter 22, as John gives this vision of what the future will be in eternity, as the multitude of God's people are with him, says there will no longer be any curse, no more suffering, no more pain, no more death. All the things that came because of Satan are going to be done. No more curse. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that something to look forward to? And, you know, and we often like to read these passages at the, you know, when a brother or sister passes away, because sometimes we watch somebody, a dear Christian, who dies after a very difficult and painful illness. Something that could be long drawn, and we can't help but wonder why. They were believers. They had a great relationship with God. Why? Okay, so what we want to do is to look. Okay, there are a few passages. Romans 8. Look at what Paul says here. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. Okay, there it puts it into perspective. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought to the freedom and glory of the children of God. That's it. That's what we're talking about. That's the world in which we live. The world that is subject to bondage, decay. Okay, so I want to look at two sides of the coin here, the bad side and the good side. So, all right, so what are the bad things that come from trials? You know, you think about it. If we allow it to, you know, and it depends upon the attitude that we have toward our trials. And I just basically want to point out that there are some books of the Bible that really draw on this quite strongly. Job was a righteous man, and God allows Satan to just wipe him out and wipe out his health. And Job's wife says, you know, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Just curse God and die. Whoa. That's a real help, isn't it? But you know, the human tendency is to kind of wallow in the misery, the issues, the problems that we have. So Psalms, we've had some of those. So we get to the idea of what we call complaint, moaning, why me? You know, Job really, I mean, you look at a lot of Job, it's like, why me? And Job's wonderful friends say, it's because you're a bad guy. Well, God's established at the beginning of the book that he was a righteous man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. So beyond that, there's the questioning and the doubt. And Job actually says, when his wife says, curse God and die, and Job says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Now, I want you to notice something here. You may not have thought about this. What is the implication of what Job is saying here? Who does he attribute his suffering to? God. He's saying that all of his suffering is coming from God. It's not, it's coming from Satan. But Job doesn't understand. And that's why it's important. You know, I said at the very beginning, we need to have a theology that really gives us, you know, and I don't like the word theology, but to understand that we need to have a biblical worldview that helps us to understand the problem of good and evil, of pain and suffering, and put it into its perspective so that we can, at least partly, as far as we're capable of, understanding what's happening. But it goes back to that ground rule that time and chance happen to all. Suffering and hardship happens to everybody. It may differ in circumstance, it may differ in degrees, but it's part of what happened because of Adam and Eve. And so Job partly blames God for it. So, second, in the parable of the soils, or the sower, depending on how you like, you know, different people have different views of it. Think about the thorny, the weedy, you know, however you want to put it. Those are where the cares of the world have choked out the word. You know, that when we're dealing with trials, when we're dealing with hardship, when we get really down, we're not listening to God. You know, and that's really hard because we're cutting ourselves off from that. And our reaction to our trials can separate us from God. God doesn't do that. And, you know, I was interested, Vince started out with reading this passage. And I'm going to read it again because it's just such a, you know, because Paul says in Romans 8:35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present or the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Nothing can take us away from God except us. Have you ever thought about that? We're the ones that can take us our way. And that's why it's important that we understand this, and we understand that when we're suffering, it's not because God is punishing us. It's because it's just a fact, the reality of life. Okay, so let's flip the coin. Rather than wallowing in the negative, let's consider why are trials important? What's the positive side of this coin? Okay, so number one, we gain encouragement, comfort, and courage through them. The song Amazing Grace, through many dangers, toils, and snares I have, you know, and it was basically acknowledging the fact that it's been hard to get here. But where I am, I want to keep going. And I like Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And I want to just note something here. The older translations would say that all things work together for good. No. That's kind of not a great translation. It's that in all things, God works for good. It's not the things that work for good, it's God. works for good for his people. That no matter what happens to us, God can turn and bring good out of it. That's why we get comfort and courage and encouragement through what we've been through. We just sang that. I still have joy. Out of all the things I've been through, I still have joy. I still have peace. I still have, think of all those things. Okay, secondly, is that these things test and validate us. Many years ago, we went on vacation. We were in South Dakota visiting some of the old gold mines. The old prospectors down there would be digging around in the streams and the hills, and the Black Hills, South Dakota. And they find something shiny. And oh, I got gold. I'm rich. I'm rich. Well, they had to take it to a person called an assayer. So that's that word, assay. And the assayer would take that piece of mineral that the man had and would subject it to extreme heat, fire, to see what it did. Because there's another mineral called iron pyrite that is popularly known as fool's gold. Why? Because it looks like gold, but it's not. It can't stand up to the test. It fails. So the assayer determines whether it's real gold or not and how pure gold it is. And you think about it, what our trials and what our sufferings do is they show to us and to God our faith, how solid we really are. They teach us about and bring us closer to God. And I put the term worship here. It's so important that we are able to, and what I love is the Psalm, 119th, the acrostic Psalm that Everett mentioned last week. It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. We learn through our trials and through our sufferings. And then they help change and transform us. And close to the idea of assaying is the idea of tempering. When I was in junior high school, which was grades 7, 8, and 9 where we lived, we had shop class. And one of the shops we had was metal class. And we made what were called punches. A punch is a really simple little tool. And we take a kind of a 6-sided rod of steel and cut it off to where it would be about that long, put it on a lathe and lathe it down at one end to come to a point. So we could use that as a punch. We could use it to mark metal to, that where we're going to drill, or we could use that to help set a nail into the wood. And so after we finished lathing it, the teacher said, now do not hit that with a hammer yet. We'd be like, well, what? It's steel. Steel's strong. He said, well, no, it's not. It needs one more thing. And we would take it and hold it with gloves on our hands and put on goggles and tongs. And we hold that and put that into a fire until it was glowing red hot. And that process is called tempering. And that's when steel gets its strength. It's when it's tempered. And you know what? That's when people get their strength. You never know what you're capable of until you've been through hard times and until you have had some suffering and hardship and trials in your life. And so we need that tempering. So Romans 5, 3-5, Paul says, not only so we glory in our sufferings. Glory? You glory when you're having a bad day? Well, we know the suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame. Some of the translations say hope does not disappoint us. Because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. So how do we face trials? What is it that we can do with that? Okay, and I'm suggesting 3 basically things. Number 1, pray. Jesus, in the garden, before he was arrested and crucified the next day, prayed, Father, I pray that you let this cup pass from me, but not my will. Your will be done. Sometimes in prayer we wrestle with the will and purpose of God. Sometimes we look at praying for things like wisdom, strength, perseverance. Lord, help me to get through this. It's important. Okay, secondly, is we need to use and to learn from our suffering, from our trials, from our difficulties. Hebrews says Jesus learned obedience from the things he suffered, and that's not really in the way we see Jesus, is it? Last week, Edward made a statement. I made a note of it right there. Talking about praying in difficulty and hardship, and he prayed, what do you want me to learn from this, Lord? We need to learn from what's happening. Sometimes we realize that the reason we're suffering is because we did something we shouldn't have done. We made a poor choice, and it's a consequence of that choice. Sometimes it is something that we learn that we have and need an opportunity to use what we have for other people. Many of you know that I have had some real challenges through my life. In my 30s, I had some severe back problems and ended up with major surgery on my back. I had a fusion on my lower back. I've had 1 heart attack, 3 strokes. I have had cancer twice. And for the first cancer, I had surgery and chemotherapy. I walk with a cane, should be walking with a walker. And basically, I'd say to God, not why, but what do you want me to learn from this? And what it is I feel like he wants me to take what I have learned and what I have experienced and share it with others to say, suffering and hardship is not God. There used to be a character on TV named Maud. Many of you would never be in it. But Maud's favorite line was, God will get you for that. No, God's not getting us. Satan is getting us. God is helping us recover and use what's happened to us for good. That's the promise. And that's where we need to go. And so what we need to do is to use our suffering, our problems, our trials as an opportunity for growth. Okay, so James says, look at this, consider it joy, pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Perseverance keeps popping up in these passages? Perseverance. Let your perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Okay, 2 weeks ago, Ashoke talked about this passage in Hebrews 12, 7-13, and we won't go back through it again, but the last part of the verse is on the next slide, so that we can share his holiness and discipline, which is training. Training is hard. When I was in my early teens, my best friend at church seriously ran all state, and sometimes after church, Eddie would come over to our house for lunch, and Eddie would look at some of the things, and he'd say politely, no thank you, I'm in training. And so he didn't eat carbs, he didn't eat sweets, he didn't eat anything that would in any way detract from his training for running cross country, because he was in New York State. Millions and I can't remember how many millions of people lived in New York. But he was all state as a runner because he paid the price. And so we want to go to the beginning of Hebrews 12 here at the end. So the writer of Hebrews starts out chapter 12. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Okay, cloud is interesting because it's not a crowd, it's a cloud. There are so many people here in this group that it's not just a crowd, it's a cloud of witnesses. And that number, well, who or what is in that cloud? Well, all right, the Hebrew writer was not keeping, okay, let's end chapter 11 and now let's start chapter. That wasn't added till later. He wrote chapter 11 and just went right on into what we read in chapter 12. There was no transition there, except the words therefore. Therefore refers back to what he said before that. Well, what did he say before that? These are the great people of faith. Hebrews 11, we talk about it, is the great chapter of faith in the Bible. And these people have finished. So think about it. You go to a stadium, I think about, there are stadiums around the world that hold 100,000 or more people. That just boggles my mind. It's like 20 people down in the field getting exercise and 100,000 people watching them. Yes. And this cloud is watching us as we run this race. The Greek-Roman world was very familiar with one of the things about the tours that we've been on. We saw these great stadiums from the ancient world. And the Greeks like to compete, and they like to watch people compete. And, when you're watching the competition, it's not like the gladiators where you're watching a win-lose. But this cloud of witnesses that is watching us is rooting for us because they have run the race. They have experienced the failure. They have had the hardships and the trials. And they're not looking at us saying, oh, boy, you really blew it. They're looking at us and saying, get up, keep going. You can finish. Doesn't matter how many times you fall down, keep going. And so they are cheering for us to finish the race. And so the question that he answers in the last part of the verse is, how much do you want to finish that race? Okay, the Greek word for training, gymnao, we get gymnasium from it. It comes from the word naked. Did you know that? The Greeks, when they competed in a race, took everything off. Now that you've got that in your mind, you can't get it out of there. I don't think I would want to pay to watch that. But they took off anything that in any way that could hinder them from running and finishing that race. And the writer of Hebrews says, let us remove everything that in any way could hinder, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and then let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. See, we're looking at Jesus. We're watching with Jesus. That word consider, that song we're about to sing, consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men that you might not grow weary. Remember what I said is what can separate us from God? It's us. We get tired of the race. We get frustrated with the opposition and lose heart. Because we say, oh, it's just too hard. The writer of Hebrews is saying that there is nothing that we should allow to come between us and where we're going as God's people. Because it is worth anything we have to do, any price we have to pay. And God has done everything. He's given us Christ. He's given us the perfect sacrifice for our sins. That the only thing standing between us and eternity is us. So let's stand as we sing this last song.